Okay, so now we're gonna move on to the bone tissue, and that is our tissue that is responsible for mechanical support for our ability to mobilize from one region to the other. Our bone tissue is also responsible for being a reservoir for minerals to supply us with calcium salt and phosphate salt and to ensure that there is homeostasis of calcium. If there is excessive, I'm sorry? Yeah. So we move on to studying bone tissue and how bone tissue is important for the bone tissue is important for mineral homeostasis and calcium. We don't want too little calcium because that is gonna interfere with our heart. With our heart, these vibration electrical stimulations that induce the pumping action of the heart, they will be affected if there's too little calcium. If there's too little calcium, we're going to end up with porous, weak bone, making us susceptible for bone fracture. If we have too much calcium, then that's going to do what? We mentioned that on the first lecture that we had. Why is too much calcium? The more the better. The more calcium, the better. Okay, the more calcium going to make you really strong. Is that true?
No.
So why is we said too little calcium is going to impair heart function and cause arrhythmia, and it's going to disrupt the electrical stimulation of the heart. So too much calcium is going to do the same. It's also going to cause premature ventricular contractions. That's as far as the heart is concerned. And we said that if too little calcium, then we're going to have porous bone that is weak and degenerated. What about the other problem? And the problem is if you have too much calcium, why is that a form of a problem? So we said that that's if if too little calcium, that's going to impair nerve stimulation of the excitable cardiac tissues. What if now we have too little, or too much calcium? It's the same thing. It's also going to affect our heart skeletal tissue, our heart muscle excitation, and gonna cause arrhythmia. What else? Too much calcium. How about kidney stones? They're gonna start calcifying and making kidney stone. What about the heart valve? The heart valve is gonna get so sticky and calcified. What about enzymes that's supposed to be off, but too much calcium? You know, calcium is an enzyme activator. It turns on some enzymes that are supposed to be off. And that's going to cause the autocatalytic destruction of our own pancreas. Okay? Are we clear? Hypercalcemia, yeah. So now we have to study how we regulate this calcium homeostasis in our body. How we regulate that we do not have hypercalcemia, we do not have hypocalcemia, we just have eucalcemia. Okay. So the skeletal system is composed of bones, cartilage, and ligaments that are joined to form a framework for the body. So in osteology is the study of the bone, and cartilage is the forerunner of most bones and covers many joint surfaces. So the ligaments hold the bones together at the joints, and the tendons attach the muscle to the bone. So the roles of the skeleton, number one, are to support the limb bones and the vertebra. So they support the limb bones and the vertebra support body, and the jaw bones support the teeth, and some bones support the viscera. So you have your brain that's like, you put your money inside a safe. The safe is made of iron. So your brain is more precious than all the money and the gold and the silver. So that's why it has to have a case around it. So when you're wearing a helmet, that's actually your second helmet. The first helmet is your skull. and it protects the brain. So it's important for support, important for protection. The bone is important for the movement. We cannot move our body and breathing. So we have these intercostal muscles that once they receive electrical stimulation, muscle is an excitable tissue. When the muscles receive electrical stimulation, they expand. When they expand, they increase the transverse thoracic diameter of the rib cage. When they increase that, what happens to the lungs? They expand. When they expand, the volume increases, the pressure decreases, and then air flows in to saturate the lungs. When air saturates the lungs, now oxygen is going to be able to diffuse into the blood. The opposite. If I want to exhale, now the rib cage made of bones is going to contract. That's going to expel all of the oxygen outside of our body. Going to expel all of the carbon dioxide, metabolic waste, out of our lungs. There's also acid-base balance. Acid-base balance. So the acid-base balance, it buffers the blood against large pH changes by altering the phosphate and the carbonate salt levels. So remember, we said that the bone is a reservoir. Okay, the bone is a reservoir of, it's a bank of salt, supply us and nourish us with the proper restoration of salt levels. So blood formation. So the red bone marrow is the chief producer of blood cells. And for hormone secretion, the bone cells secrete hormones that affect the action of insulin and moderate the stress response. So the bone is a form of a tissue that is known as osseous tissue. And that is, osseous tissue is a type of connective tissue with the matrix hardened by calcium phosphate and other minerals. So mineralization or calcification is the hardening process of the bone. So individual bones, each an organ, consist of bone tissue, bone marrow, cartilage, adipose tissue, nervous tissue, and fibrous connective tissue. So the word bone can refer to an organ or just the osseous tissue. But rest assured that the bone is not just made up of bone. There's also blood. There's also cartilage. There's also adipose tissue and nerve tissue, fibrous tissue that is also associated with the bone. So there are structurally, remember in anatomy and physiology, we look at the structure. Structurally, the flat bones are thin, curved plates that protect the soft organs, and the examples are the parietal bones of the skull, the sternum, the scapula, the ribs, and the hip bones. There are long bones. These long bones are longer than wide, and they are like rigid levers that are acted upon by the muscles, and they are crucial for the movement. So you have examples are the humerus bone, the radius, the ulna, the femur, the tibia. These are long bones, while your flat bones, these are your parietal bones of the skull, the sternum, the scapula, the ribs, and the hip bones. So some bones don't fit in the above categories. So we call them irregular bones and short bones. So short bones are approximately equal in length and width. So an example of that would be the bones of the wrist and the ankle. There are irregular bones. These are bones that are elaborate in shape. An example would be the vertebra and some skull bones. So now let's look at the long bones. So the long bones are compact, dense, or cortical bones. These have a dense outer shell. These bones have dense outer shells. These bones have dense outer shells that are enclosed that are around the marrow or the medullary cavity. So the bone marrow is important because it is the integration center for making more blood cells, for making white blood cells, for hematopoiesis, for leukopoiesis, for the megakaryosis, the making of the platelets. So that is the center of my bone. So the bone looks strong from the outside, but from the inside, it has this jelloish mesh of trabecula and canaliculi. These are your bone marrow. So we have spongy bone, but it's not at all soft like a sponge. So they call it spongy because it has holes, porous. So in osteoporosis, what happens is these pore sizes become smaller or bigger. They get bigger. So that makes your bone really hollow from inside and makes you susceptible for fracture. And both happen to men and women. There is a postmenopausal or menopausal osteoporosis, and for men there is senile osteoporosis. So when they get really old, the men, and they have a drop in testosterone, what happens now is these bones are gonna fracture. The diaphysis is a shaft that provides leverage, and the epiphysis is an enlarged end of a long bone. So they strengthen the joint and anchor the ligaments and the tendons. The epiphyseal line is a remnant of the childhood growth bone, the epiphyseal plate. The general anatomy of a long bone is the articular cartilage, which is a layer of the hyaline cartilage that covers the joint surface, and it allows the joint to move more freely. So there is a nutrient foramina, and it has minute holes in the bone surface that allows the blood vessels to penetrate. We also have the periosteum. It is the external sheath covering most of the bone. That is the outer fibrous layer of the collagen and the inner osteogenic layer of the bone forming cells. There is a perforating fibers. These perforating fibers of the periosteum, they penetrate the underlying bone matrix, and there's the endosteum. The endosteum is a thin layer of reticular connective tissue lining the marrow cavity and all the internal bone surfaces. So the flat bones have a sandwich-like structure. There's an inner and outer tables of compact bone enclosing the layer of the spongy bone in between, called the diploid in the cranium. So that shows us our red bone marrow. And I think one of the questions on the exam was to make sure you identify, able to tell what is that. That is the red bone marrow. See, that's the red bone marrow. That's the epiphysis. That's the diaphysis. So the diaphysis is the shaft that provides the leverage, and the epiphysis is the enlarged end of the long bone. So that one is important for the joint. So the epiphysis is so wide because that is where you have an articulation at the site of the joint. Now, when we look at the histology of the bones, when we examine the histology of the bone, there are 4 types of bone cells. There are osteogenic cells, and these are stem cells that are found in the osteum and the inner layer of the periosteum. And they arise from embryonic mesenchyme, and they multiply continuously and give rise to the osteoblast. Osteoblasts, these are bone-forming cells in the endosteum and the inner layer of the periosteum. They perform osteogenesis, and they synthesize soft organic matter of matrix, and they promote the mineralization of the bone matrix. So stress, like working out, that stimulates the osteogenic cells to multiply rapidly and increase the number of the osteoblasts, which reinforce the bone. There are 4 types of bone cells, continuing with osteoblasts and osteogenic cells. Osteocytes are former osteoblasts that have become trapped in the matrix they deposited. So we have the lacunae and the canaliculi. So the lacunae are tiny cavities where osteocytes reside, and the canaliculi are little channels that connect the lacunae, and these are cytoplasmic processes of osteocytes that reach into the canaliculi and contact processes of neighboring cells, gap junctions, and the gap junctions allow for the passage of nutrients, waste, and waste signals. So some osteocytes reabsorb the bone matrix while others deposit it, and they act as strain sensors when they are stressed, and they produce biochemical signals that regulate the process of bone remodeling. When we examine the osteoclasts, they are the opposite of osteoblasts. And these osteoclasts are the active cells when we are suffering from osteoporosis. So these osteoclasts are rich in lysosomal degradative proteolytic enzymes. These enzymes enable them to destroy bone. So when we have a little bit of calcium in our body, the osteoclasts get activated, they get turned from off to on, from inactive to active, and they start degrading the bone, liberating bone powder, liberating calcium into the blood, enriching the blood with more calcium, increasing the level of calcium in the blood. But the opposite, if we already have too much calcium in the blood, now we need to deposit, take away calcium from the blood and put it in the bone tissue. And that is achieved not by the osteoclast, but by the osteoblast. So they often reside in pits called the resorption bays that they etch into the bone surface. So this is an osteogenic cell, and that's the osteoclast that leads to the osteoclast development. So you see the osteoclast has rough borders and a lot of lysosomes. These are the cells that help them destroy and degrade the bone matrix. So the bone matrix is composed by dry weight from 1/3 organic and 2/3 inorganic matter, such as calcium and phosphate. And the organic matter is synthesized by the osteoblast, where collagen and carbohydrate protein complexes such as the glycosaminoglycans, the proteoglycans, and the glycoproteins. So the inorganic matter is a mineral component, and it has about 85% hydroxyapatite. That's very important to know this. So the hydroxyapatite substance is a crystallized calcium phosphate salt, and that is what gives our bone its really tensile strength. It's the hydroxyapatite, and it comprises about 85% of our inorganic bone matter. So the combination forms a composite material that provides flexibility and strength. So the collagen and the minerals of the bone form a composite material that provides flexibility and strength, and the mineral portion allows the bone to support the body weight without sagging. And rickets is a disease that is caused by the mineral deficiency and it results in soft, deformed bones. So the protein portion gives some flexibility, and the collagen molecules contain sacrificial bonds that break under stress. And osteogenesis imperfecta, that's known as marble bone disease. Marble bone disease or brittle bone disease results from a defect in the collagen deposition. Okay,